So it seems that it's very difficult to pick a top 5 for everyone, but we have unity with nature, protecting the environment, equality, social justice, creativity and freedom are popular as well. Wisdom. And then our bottom 5, sense of belonging in there, always a weird one, we'll come back to that. Our bottom 5 is wealth, preserving my public image, successful, maybe national security is unpopular, obedience. Yeah, some of you may have sort of got this already, but they're not randomly jumbled. They're actually data points. And they show the relationship between values across 64,000 people in 65 countries. And what they show is when you ask people what they value, the closer the 2 points are together, the more likely that people will prioritize those values similarly. So if someone values equality a lot, they're likely to value broad-mindedness and protecting the environment a lot as well. Or equally, if they don't value broad-mindedness a lot, they're unlikely to value equality and protecting the environment a lot. And the further apart they are, if they're very far apart, then they're likely to be prioritised differently. So people will tend to prioritise one over the other. So for instance, equality, if someone values that a lot, they're unlikely to also value social power or wealth or authority a lot. Makes sense. And this holds all the way around on some level. Because there are so many of these, there are some strange ones. So I don't always understand why sense of belonging is there. And there's a few others that are in slightly weird places. And between the different samples in the different countries, some of these move slightly. But what they found across many, many more samples is that there are groups that hold more consistently. And so they grouped them along these lines, and they gave those groups names and definitions. So most of our top values, our most important values to solve the issues that we're concerned about, are in universalism, some in self-direction, and 1 or 2 in benevolence. And most of our values that we don't think are important are in power, some in achievement, some in hedonism, some in security, and 1 or 2 in tradition. And so all of this is in the handbook from page 13 or so onwards, so you can look at this later. And this is the original, just so that you can tell it wasn't always jazzy. I added the colours, I'm sorry about the colours. And so you can represent that as a circular diagram, which is called a circumplex. It's just to represent those relationships. So the width of it is its sort of conceptual width, what it means. And then so for universalism, someone who values universalism a lot is also likely to value self-direction and also likely to value benevolence a lot. They're unlikely to value achievement and power a lot. It's not that they won't value these, it's just they tend to value them less. And vice versa, if someone values achievement a lot, they're likely to value power a lot, hedonism, and they're unlikely to value these as much. And so the researchers also created supergroups on top of that. The definitions. So our top values, the definition of universalism is the understanding, appreciation, tolerance, and protection for the welfare of all people and for nature. Yay! And power is social status and prestige, control or dominance over people and resources. And so those are in tension, basically. You tend to value one over the other. And so the researchers found these other 2 axes as well, these supergroups. Oh, sorry, this is the original. Jazzed up. Jazzed. These supergroups here. And they're 2 axes. So openness to change and conservation, self-transcendence and self-enhancement. And we don't focus on this axis as much because it doesn't seem to be as important for these sorts of issues. It seems to be this axis that's really where the action is in terms of social and environmental issues. And we don't use this terminology though, partly because there is another literature around goals which finds very similar things and uses slightly different language, which we just think is a little bit more intuitive or easy to understand. So we talk about intrinsic and extrinsic values, okay? So intrinsic values are these 3 here. and extrinsic is achievement and power here. Okay? And so intrinsic values are ones that are inherently rewarding to pursue, so they're ends in themselves. So they're things like affiliation to friends and family, connection with nature, concern for others, self-acceptance, social justice, creativity, lots of the stuff that we've put down and more. The extrinsic values, they're values that are centred on external approval or rewards. So if someone else is giving you something. So they're things like wealth or material success, concern about image or status, prestige, social power and authority. Okay? And their intention. So this is what the research found. When you value universalism a lot, you're unlikely to value power as much, and you're also likely to value self-direction and benevolence. And so there's five important things to remember about values that I'm just going to go through quickly. So the first one is that they're universal. So they're not just universal culturally in terms of seeming to apply across many cultures. They're universal in that we all value all of these things, just to varying degrees. Okay, so we're all bundles of contradictions and tensions and conflicts, because in any given day or week or month or whatever, we'll operate on all of these different things. It's just that we will have stronger values in some areas, so we'll do things more in line with those strong values more often. But there are various things that shift us around here, which we'll come back to later. So it's not, I think in Britain we talk about values in a very binary sense, in a sort of on or off sense. Either you value community or you don't. Either you value honesty or you don't. Either you value family or you don't. It's not like that. We value all of those things. It's just how we sort of order them that matters. Which ones are more important to us than others. And when you can, and they sort of operate in this structure. They're not characteristics. So this is where I need some help for you, because I only have an English example of this, which might not make sense to you. But here are two people. In the UK, they're both famous. They both have a lot of image or status. But their motivations, I would say, are very different. So their characteristic of fame or image is not to be confused with their motivations, because a lot of the language on these boards can be confused with characteristics of things. So this is Tony Benn, who's a famous Labour politician. And this is Jeremy Clarkson from Top Gear. He's sort of a petrol head. I don't know who he is. But now you guys are going to help me out with some Swedish examples, okay?
Sorry.
Huh?
We are sorry. We weren't very clear.
Okay. So it's in effect the point that famous people are not necessarily motivated by achievement, by their own fame. There will be people who are motivated by some of the very intrinsic examples. It's just that they become famous because of that motivation. So in the UK, another famous example which we could use on the left side is David Attenborough, who does a lot of the nature programs. He's very famous, but he's not really motivated by his own fame. He just loves the natural world and talking about it. Similarly, we might refer to a powerful social movement. We're not saying that they're motivated by power. Historically, they're far more likely to be motivated by social justice and equality, but just they achieve the characteristic of power through what they do. Also, pleasurable activities are not always motivated by pleasure. You can achieve pleasure. You can have, things can be pleasurable pursuing any of your values, if you see what I mean. It's just there's a characteristic and a motivation which can be confused. There's another example, a study in the US, which found that artists who were more motivated by fame and success and sort of money were less likely to be successful than ones that were motivated by more intrinsic goals. So in that situation, sort of achievement as a motivation hindered achievement as an outcome or characteristic. Okay, so that is the problem with the language. And then there are these three effects, which were found after 1992. So after Shalom Schwartz published that paper, dozens of other social psychologists sort of came in and tried to poke the model and break it and expand it into different areas. And what they found was these three effects, which happen not just when you ask people what they value, they happen in real time, they happen live, okay? So when Shalom Schwartz's work was all about asking people, what do you value? And they tell you what they value. This is actually sort of engaging different values and seeing them change, okay? So the examples will make this clearer. So the first one is the priming effect, or engagement. So you can engage or prime a value, so you can tug on a value and through a communication or an experience. And that will temporarily make that value more important to someone. Okay? So I picked a particular study. This is a study that the Common Cause Group commissioned from Cardiff and Lancaster University in the UK. And it just highlights this sort of priming activity. So we took 700 adults from the UK, asked them what their values were, and from the top 10% who were more extrinsically motivated, okay, so the values that we said we didn't think were important, we picked 30 of them. And we asked them to write either, we split them into two groups, about reasons for valuing these intrinsic values, so these three, acceptance, affiliation, and broad-mindedness, or the extrinsic values, so popularity, image, and wealth. So two groups, one asked to reflect on intrinsic values, another asked to reflect on extrinsic values, but they're all extrinsically oriented people, okay? And then we asked a series of questions, and then we interviewed them about 4 issues, 2 on the environment, loss of countryside, climate change, 2 on poverty, and child mortality. And we transcribed those interviews, and we sent them to a linguist who got the transcripts, and he didn't know which group anyone was in, and he was asked a series of questions about the way that they talked about those issues. So the first one was how intrinsic or extrinsic were their general discussion. So he found that those who had been asked to think about the intrinsic values were more likely, at a scale from 1 to 3, to speak intrinsically around some of those values. And I'll give you some examples in a second. We then asked, did they say that someone should do something about it or not? Okay? So these 4 different problems, they found that those that had been asked just to reflect on sort of broad-mindedness and affiliation were more likely to say that someone should do something about the problem than those that have the extrinsic prime. And then, if they should do something, did they sort of say that we should do it for global reasons, for a common good, or only if it's in our self-interest? Okay? And the intrinsically primed group were more likely to say we should do it even if it isn't in our self-interest.
This is a question. What's the scale?
So a scale is 1 to 3, it's in the study, so it's sort of a linguist scale about how significant those different things were. So this one is, 1 is they didn't say anything at all, 3 is they were very much saying it had to be that. And it's the actual items are described in the study, which I can give you. A lot of these examples are quite political, and I think they're political because politicians are the ones playing around with this stuff to appeal to different values the most. But if you think about those two, one is very, taxpayers' money is very individualised, it's very, what am I getting out of this, where is my money being spent? Public money is much more about us, what are we choosing to spend our money on collectively? And it implies that if there's some things that I'm not interested in, that's fine because I'm part of a society which there are lots of people with lots of interest. And thinking about the values there. There's a famous example in the US. George Lakoff, who is a cognitive linguist in the US, has made framing very popular again by writing a few books on it. And he uses the example of tax relief versus tax cut. And it seems really silly to me. It seems really basic and simple. But he talks about how overnight the entire Republican Party and all their related commentators and others stopped talking about tax cut and started talking about tax relief. And he points out why they did this. It's because tax relief, relieving something, implies a burden, something is bad, and it implies someone coming along to relieve that burden, so there is a person that's coming along to help. And anyone standing in the way of that person who's coming along to help is bad. Seems simple, doesn't it? But he points out that they did that, and the other, Democratic Party and other people just followed along with it and followed into that frame, which was actually very unhelpful in terms of the long-term implications. But they're not all examples like this. So there is a sister report to Common Cause called Finding Frames for Development. So it's a report that by a coalition of development groups in the UK, where they take Common Cause and they apply it to development and come up with specific recommendations. And some of the things they do also look at frames. And they pull out charity as a potentially problematic frame. And the reason they do that is they say that it risks normalising unjust relationships. So it implies a powerful giver and a grateful receiver, and it potentially obscures the reality of the situation. And they talk about Make Poverty History, which is a big campaign in the UK and in other countries I know in similar ways. And that their rallying call was justice, not charity, and the importance of that. But on a side note, they also point out that the public's understanding was that it was a lot of charities saying that. So it was quite a confusing thing. You know, justice, not charities, say charities, which is pretty confusing for people. And then rogue trader is one I threw in. I don't have any academic research, I just don't like it. So rogue trader, does everyone sort of, I mean, that's used a lot in the UK at the moment around bankers. So they will identify one or two bankers that have lost lots of money, and they say they're a rogue trader, so a banking trader. Rogue means that they're, so what it's trying to do is contain and isolate and say it's just some bad apples, it's just a few people that have done the wrong thing, it's not anything bigger. So it's very like squashing the problem, making it smaller. And I would say it's a rogue sector, or at least a proportion of a sector that's gone rogue. It's not simply a few people. But it's interesting the language that is used, and all media outlets in the UK talk about rogue traders when they come out, which I just find interesting. It's not just about implication, it's also about metaphor. So if you think, well, in the UK, nanny state is this really big thing. I don't know if you get that here, but it's meant to imply a nanny state. I didn't have a nanny. A nanny is someone who isn't your mother who looks after you when you're young. It's really big with the Conservative Party, I think, because probably a lot of them have nannies. The idea here, though, is nanny state is a controlling state that's trying to constantly make you do things and stop you doing other things and things. So it's used to counter any sort of regulation of anything, pretty much in the UK. It's really powerful because it's repeated so often, but it has a particular metaphor around nannying. And then Mother Earth, if you think about the different sort of conceptualizations of nature, Mother Earth is trying to tap into a very nurturing, collective sort of, metaphor for nature. And the most important thing, I think, to remember about framing, well, there's two really important things. The first is it's not just about language. So that frames are cognitive things in our minds, so they're also about experience and engagement. So if you think about the different values that are, embodied in participation versus hierarchy, I don't like this stage. I'd like to be on your level. But we design systems and things that are hierarchical, some of them are participatory, but they engage different values in people because of the frames that they use. And then the second most important thing about framing, and why I don't talk about it loads, is I think because ultimately framing is a question of power, because they're reinforced through repeated engagement. It's who gets to frame something, who gets to decide how we think about this particular thing, because we know that it really importantly shapes how we think things are and how we think things ought to be. So there's a good study in the UK where they frame crime as either a monster or as a virus. Okay? And they find that when you frame them in those different ways, people come up with very different solutions to the problem. So with a monster, it's very much like lock people up. With a virus, it's do things in the community, get to the root causes, stop the reason that crime bubbles up, sort of thing. So for me, I think frames are really important. I think they're necessary for us to think about them, but I worry that some people, particularly in the UK and NGOs, think this is all we need to do. They think that if we just swap the words around and add these different language in, then we'll solve the problem. And I think we'll talk more tomorrow about how it's important, we need to know it, but it's not enough. And then this is just some other stuff I pulled out. So here are my values at the start of last year. You can do a survey online. It's not a very nice survey, so I'm hoping to make it nicer. If I know anything about this, is that it's biased, having read a lot of social science. So you can lop some off of here, and you can put them down here. Because, we could have asked you those value questions before today and after today, and they'd be very different. And they wouldn't necessarily have been because of the value change. But so this is broadly in the shape that you'd expect on some level. So they predict that there are some values that are very strong, and then they reduce down from there. So there are some anomalies. I'm not very high on benevolence. I think a lot of people actually are quite like that, and I think there's an interesting study. There should be research on that, because I know there is another context, about how that people who are very universally focused struggle to do things in their own community sometimes, or struggle to do things close to them. So I'm always thinking about everything big, and sometimes don't do that. My achievement value is quite high. or higher than you'd expect maybe. That comes up a lot when I talk to groups, particularly UK NGO people, particularly senior people. They say, well, haven't we got to achieve things? Haven't we got to be ambitious and successful? And they sort of confuse, I mean, yes, that's true, but when you look at the definitions of these things, they're very much about personal success, for a start. They're also about sort of personal success according to social standards. So whatever the standards are in society, not something, you know, success collectively on these big issues. But the other thing is, I just think we have to acknowledge that probably a lot of people, someone who's willing to stand up in front of 100 people and talk probably does have slightly higher achievement values. I don't know. But until we start naming it and talking about it and acknowledging that it's there, then I think we struggle, because there's a lot of ego in NGOs, and I think we don't talk about it enough probably. And then security value, I'm really happy that this I think in the past has been much higher. I come from quite a working class family in the UK, and my family are obsessed with security. Like, UK's got a real security thing. And yeah, even my dad to this day he'll leave the glove compartment in a car, you know, the bit where you put stuff, he leaves that open, even though it's locked, just so that people can't see there's nothing in there, in case they want to break in, just in case there was something in there. We lived in the countryside on a little estate, and we would have the windows locked all the time, you know, or we'd go out and there'd be a window slightly open and we'd have to stop and go and lock it and stuff. So it's taken me a long time to sort of work through and just not be so security focused. And then from the European Social Survey, these are UK values. So I wanted to pull out Swedish values, but it's really complicated. And the academic who I usually use to help me do it didn't get back to me in time. But here I see a few things. So the first thing is that these are the top 3 values. Benevolence is number 1, universal is number 2, self-direction is number 3, followed by security 4. Most people don't think that. Most people are surprised when they see that, particularly when people are from the UK. One of the things is because earlier in the presentation I've talked about extrinsically oriented people, so you sort of have this idea in your mind that extrinsically oriented people have really high things here. Now what we don't know is whether this is a social desirability bias, so whether people just think, you know, they say these things but they don't really value them. That may be the case. We know that they've done studies where they get someone to fill out the survey, the value survey, and then they ask friends and families to also fill it out for that person in order to work out whether the survey is a legitimate way of doing it. And they found that that works, so that correlates. But that doesn't tell you whether there's a social desirability bias, because if there is, it acts on everyone. So those people thinking, what does he value? Well, he obviously values these things. But even if that, so when we talk about extrinsically oriented people, they tend to be people where this is just higher and this is a bit lower, so the balance between them is shifted. And when you ask people what they value, they say these things a lot. When you ask them what society values, they say these things a lot. Which I think is interesting for one of 2 reasons, I suppose. It seems like there are 2 options here. One possibility is that we've created a society in which, British society at least I can speak for, where we don't celebrate, where we don't create places and spaces where people can express those intrinsic values enough. And all of the places and spaces that people interact and see others interacting are very extrinsic. We were talking last night as we drove by 3 malls, didn't we, before we got to your house. And I was saying, like, what are the big buildings that countries build now? It used to be cathedrals because they worshipped a particular thing. Now Britain builds malls. That's what we worship. And so, that, you know, when you ask people, what do you think people value, then they say these things. Because there isn't enough. So that's one option, is there aren't enough spaces. The other, I think, which might be more hopeful, is that actually we do value those things quite a bit. It's just that we have a society that celebrates these values, and it pumps these values into us and tells us all about them all the time, and sort of we hear about these values. And actually everyone does value these things more strongly if you just talk to them and ask them about it, and give them a bit of time and space. But either way, for me, these values are here to be engaged and sort of worked with, a lot more than I think a lot of people would suggest, and a lot more than a lot of marketing people are willing to admit as well, it seems. And then the final thing I see is the classic freedom-security split in the UK, which is people who value security a lot, people who value freedom a lot. Because this is 1,000 people mixed together, what you miss there is that there are these tensions over liberty versus security, which is hundreds of years old. And we constantly lose. Well, since the last 20 years. Okay. We're just going to do group discussion. So at your tables, you've got 20 minutes now to chat about this. And the goal is to try and record questions and comments and thoughts. Okay? And what we'll do tomorrow morning is we'll try and go through them and then answer some of them by collating them all together. Does that work? And so we have more time tomorrow for questions and things as well. So at your tables, the facilitator should have a little thing on this. So we're not going to have the question back for the facilitators. We'll do that tomorrow. So at your tables, there's a lot to take in, discuss.